Voices of the World brings you first-hand stories about the triumphs, tragedies, and turning points that shape human lives. Hello.
Bonjour.
Servus. Grüß euch.
Swagat.
Hasta la próxima.
Now streaming, listen in to this true story.
Greetings to all the listeners. My name is Peter Sage, and I'm the Executive Director of AMRUT, which stands for Ananda Marga Universal Relief Team. I've been associated with AMRUT, which is an international relief and development organization, since 1985. So that's quite a long time. It's a lot of experience dealing with different peoples around the world in various ways. So let me start by answering a question that people ask me often, like, how did you get into this? Well, basically, when I was very young, I was interested in spirituality. Spirituality is a way that all human beings can come together and enjoy the many dimensions of life together in a more equitable and just way. So I've always been interested in reaching out to people around the world. And when I was in India, this is back in the 1980s, I was getting quite deeply involved in the spiritual practice, that's to say the yoga and the meditation practice. And I was with a guru and a spiritual movement, living in an ashram with lots of other people. And the guru was promoting taking spirituality off the mat or off the blanket and into the world. That a human being, yes, should take care of her or himself. You know, self-care is important for people, but we are part of a community, we're part of a network, we're part of a society. And so it's very important, according to our spiritual teachings, that one reaches out into the world. And so the meditation practice extends into society through just action. The yoga practice extends off the mat into socially beneficial action. So in this way, the spiritual person becomes a great asset for society. So then when I was asked in 1985 to get involved in AMRUT, I jumped at the opportunity because it was a way I could follow the teachings, as I've been explaining, to translate a spiritual practice into a social activity. So we started back then as a disaster response organization. And in 1985 itself, we decided that it would be nice to reach out to various countries in a longer term way, so through developmental programs. And we started in West Africa, in the countries Burkina Faso and Ghana. And projects are running in those countries to this day. So we believe very strongly that if we are going into a community from another culture, from another country, from another hemisphere even, that it's very important to start by listening to people, by listening to the people one aspires to serve. And so developmental work really has to come from dialogue, especially since I feel, being of English origin and now American nationality, that I'm representing societies that haven't exactly done well for all of their citizens. When we look just at the American society, healthcare is not necessarily a right, and education is not equitable for all people in society. And so when I go to, say, in this case, Ghana or Burkina Faso, then I'm representing a society that hasn't yet taken care of all of its people. And so I have to be very humble. Hence, the initial project design will come from dialogue with different peoples. And throughout the process of implementing a project, this dialogue is really quite fundamental. So as far as possible, when we are working in countries, and now we're in about 20 countries when it comes to the developmental side, we try to make sure that it's kind of co-creative, that the community is a very important voice, and ultimately that the community can take over the program. And back to Ghana, that's one of our biggest successes in terms of community ownership. Back in 1985, when we started, it was a water project that developed into about 20 villages. And 10 years ago, the project was handed over to the local community. So they managed the project technically, they managed the project financially. For all intents and purposes, it's now a self-sustaining unit that provides drinking water to those 20 villages. So we've walked away. We no longer have any interest in that program. And so this is the ideal where, as an outsider, one comes in, engages in dialogue, co-creates, and then steps aside so that the community can continue its own evolution itself. So let me say a little bit, I guess, about who we are as people, in that most of the key people in AMRUT are what we call career volunteers. They've dedicated their life to their spiritual progress and, as previously defined, to their extension into society. And so we have yoga monks, we have yoga nuns, we have lay people who have dedicated their life to trying to build more hope in more communities around the world. So I think we have a team of fantastic people. I mean, I don't want to praise our people too much, but at least what I've seen by traveling continuously around the projects for the past 30 years is that the level of dedication is quite commendable. So that's who we are. And then in the countries themselves, we'll have, some of the people I've just been describing, and then we will be employing a lot of local people. One can't obviously expect people in poor countries to volunteer their time. And so we pay decent salaries to the people in country so that they can also have a fair livelihood. Often we start with disaster response. So let's take the example of Bangladesh, where there was the influx of refugees, Rohingya refugees from Myanmar. And so AMRUT was there soon after the influx of refugees, communicating with a local NGO called SCUS. And together we started a program for children, which is actually one of our specialities, to go into a disaster area and to provide immediate support for the children, because the children obviously need to get normalized, they need to get stabilized. And this is what we do primarily through child-friendly spaces, which are a sort of a play school that normally develops into a temporary learning space and ideally over time into a school. These child-friendly spaces serve as a refuge for the children. I'll give an example actually from my last visit to Bangladesh. I was doing an evaluation of the program, and I was talking with some of the children, and they said clearly that when they came to the child-friendly space, they had a lot of insecurity. They felt uneasy socializing with other children. They had been traumatized by what they had seen in their villages back in Myanmar. I mean, they had seen things which children should not witness with their own eyes. So naturally, they had been affected emotionally with the witnessing of such trauma. But the children said that after some months, of being in the school, of being supported, because we provide psychosocial support for the children to help them, come to terms with what they've been through and to step into a new life in the new situation they find themselves. So the children said clearly that after a few months, they felt normal again. They were making friends again. They were playing again. They were feeling free again. So this is something that we take great pride in, to help children, find themselves as children again after horrific displacement. We have similar stories from Lebanon, where we've been helping the Syrian refugees for the past 6 to 7 years. And there also, we've been helping children, find their stability. But also what happens sometimes in these situations, even though there's like a desperate tragedy that's occurred and has ripped people away, from their regular day-to-day lives, but there are always silver linings. For example, in Lebanon, we've been helping the women there form support groups. And normally in that conservative Muslim culture, women would not be free to move out on their own. But because the circumstances are so different post-Civil War, the women do come and they do participate in these support groups, and they find incredible comfort in sharing their stories with other women. they find incredible solace in, sharing their woes and also building a better future together. So in addition, to these support groups, we provide various vocational training programs so the women can find a way to engage in income generation. So then we'll start after a disaster, and as far as possible, we will continue into the future with a longer-term developmental program. So that's how we function. In some countries, we just go directly. So I'm thinking now of Nigeria, where in the eastern side of Nigeria, there's an incredible amount of poverty in the rural areas. So AMRUT went in to start a maternal healthcare program. Right now we have 10 health centers. But one thing that's really significant about this project, and I guess it comes back to the conversation about community participation, is that we feel very strongly that resources exist in the places where the projects are rooted. So in this case, it's rural Nigeria. And we found that there are enough people in the local areas to hire or to train, first of all, and to hire as health workers. So instead of bringing people from the cities, at least for the lower level health workers, we identify people with some skill and aptitude. We'll send them off to a medical school for training, and then they come back to the project and they're employed in the project in the health centers. And so it's really helpful because number one, we're building capacity in the local community. Number two, when the community members come to the health center, they meet somebody they know. And so the whole health care becomes very familiar for people because, for many people in rural Nigeria, they might prefer to go to a traditional doctor or a traditional birth attendant as opposed to going to a health center, which is sort of an unknown world for them. But when they see a familiar face, then they're much more comfortable participating in the institutional healthcare. And we've also inspired the local community to begin the process of managing the health center. So this is also, a very important aspect of building local strength, community solidarity, whereby people selected by the community will be trained by AMRUT to not necessarily run the whole health center just yet, but there's a drug revolving fund, which is used to make sure that, medication is always on supply. And so the community management, they will manage that revolving drug fund. So we've been quite successful actually in our model of getting a lot of involvement from the local community and building local capacity because, as much as it's important to deliver services to people, it's equally important to make sure that people who may not have had any hope before suddenly find themselves in a situation where they're, a medical worker and they're being respected by the community. And now they have, a tremendous career path ahead of them, whether AMRUT is there or not. And so then this is quite instrumental, I think, in changing the way that a community feels about itself. So as much as we aspire to network well with the local community, it's obviously not always easy. We are coming from an industrialized world and interfacing with people who are not familiar with many of the ways of the industrialized world. So as I mentioned before, dialogue is very important and understanding at what level one can introduce a program to the local people. Now, as I mentioned before, we are yogis. We all have a spiritual practice that includes yoga and meditation. So just there, we have to be very cautious because we may be dealing with a Muslim community or a Christian community who may not trust or appreciate the teachings of yoga. And so we make sure that we don't impose the teachings of yoga at all. We don't even mention it sometimes. And it's only recently that we've been able to, in some places, include yoga for psychosocial support. So where there's a refugee crisis, for example, I mentioned Lebanon and also in Bangladesh, then we do bring yoga practices, breathing practices, some mindfulness meditation practices into the child-friendly spaces for the children, but in a way that's very secular in a way that's very palatable for people. And in the case of Bangladesh, first we have to speak with the imams, the Muslim religious leaders, to make sure that they're comfortable with AMRUT bringing in such practices. And so we have to be very cautious in that way. Secondly, we don't always meet eye to eye with the community. So let's take the case of Burkina Faso, where we thought that the local people would like wells, given that they're very dependent upon livestock for their survival. They're semi-nomadic, so they don't really cultivate. They do have kitchen gardens from time to time, but we thought it would be a pretty good idea to supplement their diet to have wells which they could use to irrigate kitchen gardens. But they were having nothing of that at all. And they actually did agree to the wells, but they ended up using them as watering holes for their animals, not for growing vegetables. So that was one example of where there was a disconnect between ourselves and the community. In Nigeria, the elders are very powerful. Well, not just in Nigeria, in many countries in Africa. The elders basically decide, what could happen in a community. And by the elders, I also mean the traditional leaders. And so it's very important to dialogue with them first, because they can make or break a project. So let's give an example from Nigeria, where, as I mentioned before, women are not familiar with going to the health center, number one. Number two, even if they wanted to go to the health center, they have to get the agreement of their husbands, because the husbands would be the ones paying for their medical care, albeit subsidized medical care. Number three, the elders have to agree that the women can go to the health center for antenatal clinics, for delivery of their babies. So it's absolutely important for us to go to the elders, which we did. There were a series of meetings where we would explain the benefits to the women, because a lot of women die at the hands of the traditional birth attendants if there's a complication at birth. And everybody knows that. So going to the health center for regular checkups and the final delivery is very important in terms of saving lives. And so in this case, it was relatively easy to find an agreement with the elders, whereby they now make sure that the women go to the health centers. And so the patronage of the 10 health centers that we've established with the community participation is really quite good, which is encouraging because it is all about saving lives. So in this way, then, the dialogue was very fruitful. And because the elders gave their agreement, the husbands have no choice but to also agree that their wives can go to the health center and the husbands will end up paying. So one has to be very sensitive. It's somewhat challenging sometimes because cultural practices may not be beneficial. I'm thinking now of Ghana, where the witch doctors would cast a spell on a given family at the request of another family. I'm not advocating sorcery, but in countries like Ghana, it is definitely something which everybody believes in, and so it has to be respected as a very deeply embedded cultural practice. So then one family will pay the witch doctor to put a curse on another family. When the cursed family finds out, then they will go to the witch doctor and they will request for the curse to be broken. And the witch doctor will ask for something as payment. Now, traditionally, it would be an animal. It could be a cow or a goat. But latterly, these witch doctors, sorcerers, have been asking for young girls, which become slaves, basically. So this, from our perspective, is not a cultural practice that is acceptable. So AMRUT didn't want to get involved directly. So what we did, we worked through a church that was fighting this practice. And to cut a long story short, ultimately Parliament passed a law, so making it illegal to accept anything other than an animal in order to break a curse on a given family. So in that sense, I think we were able to, in a very sort of stealthy way, provide support for a situation that was definitely exploitative for women. Female genital mutilation is another such cultural practice that, from the Western perspective is absolutely horrific. We haven't got involved in that directly, but I'm just giving it as an example as to whereby culturally one cannot accept everything that is being done. There's a tribe we've been working with in Kenya, the Samburu tribe. They are nomadic peoples. And so a handicapped baby or a handicapped child is a liability if they want to keep moving from place to place. And they would then throw those babies into a river when they realized they were disabled in some way to drown them. So the Catholics set up an orphanage there and said to the local people, look, no, don't throw your babies in the river. We'll take them. We'll care for them. We'll give them a good life. So I guess it's this way in every country, in every society, in every culture on the planet. There are things which are to be commended, and there are practices which could potentially be changed because they an expression of one human being's exploitation of another. So naturally, as I'm explaining, one comes across such instances and one has to deal with them as intelligently and diplomatically as possible. One thing that AMRUT tries to do is identify local leadership and to support those people in their rising into leadership positions. I mean, AMRUT's approach is that every human being has innate capacities. It doesn't matter whether one is born in a village in Ghana, if one is born in a city in India, if one is born in rural America. Every person has something to offer society. And perhaps the tragedy of many countries in the world today is that a lot of people with potential never get the opportunity to express it. In particular, now I'm thinking of young people in Africa. In some countries, like maybe 50% of young people are unemployed. But young people have potential, they have drive, they have hopes and aspirations. And it's one of the tragedies of this world that human potential is still locked in many people's hearts and doesn't get the chance for expression. So this is something that in AMRUT we take a lot of pride in, is helping people find their ways to express their talents, their skills, their leadership. So I'm thinking now of two people. One is in Burkina Faso. You know, there people have nicknames. And so this person is nicknamed Number One. Not sure why. But Number One basically runs the project there. It's a small project, which is a health education project for women. But he's the man. Another person called Emperor, another nickname, and he lives in rural Ghana. So this fellow is interesting. All of a sudden, he developed an interest in homeopathy. He was supporting AMRUT's health center in a place called Mafidekpoi in Ghana. But all of a sudden, one day, he says, I want to learn about homeopathy. I'm really interested in homeopathy. I guess somehow he'd heard somebody talking about it and maybe explored it on the internet. And so what we were able to do, we were able to bring some homeopaths from the UK to Ghana to train him. And he, in the process, has become a really good homeopath. And he's helped his people tremendously through this alternative medical health system. And so it's another example of somebody, you know, in a village, I mean, finding a talent and expressing it. I'm thinking now of two young people in Kenya. We had a program there whereby we brought a specialist from Denmark in the pantomime arts and clowning arts. And he gave a series of workshops to these youth. And some youth really showed a lot of aptitude in acting. And to cut a long story short, they're now working in some TV programs. So they got really good positions. They were spotted by somebody. I think they were in a talent competition and got spotted. And so through AMRUT, we've been able to launch their careers also. So some of these inspiring events, you know, happen sort of on the side. They're not part of a mainstream project, but one comes in touch with people who have a certain aptitude and we're able to match them with other people who have skills to offer, trainings to offer, and people then find their way to shine. So this is something that I think we can all do as human beings, right? We don't just have to write a check and give money to a charitable organization, but we can look around us in our own societies, in our own cities, in our own communities, and try to identify people with talents, with skills, who have yet to express those and find ways to match those people with others who can give them the opportunities, give them the open doors in order to help them shine in life in some way.
Goodbye.
Au revoir. Good night.
Alvida.
Hasta la próxima.
Voices of the World is produced by iUSA Radio and Podtex, a team that helps you to build a community podcast station and stream the truth about your city. To learn more and start building your own podcast business, go to www.streamthetruth.com.